After 40 years in these mountains, the footage I captured on the North Slope finally provided the one thing the government can't debunk: a Sasquatch gait so powerful that a world-class surgeon confirmed it would literally shatter a human skeleton. What experts call a man in a suit is actually a biological masterpiece that defies the known laws of anatomy, and tonight I'm showing you the evidence they tried to bury. I remember the morning I headed out toward the North Slope. The air had a bite to it that felt like needles against my skin, a sharp, dry cold that usually means the mountain is holding its breath. I've lived in these ridges long enough to know when the woods are off, but that day was different. Usually, even in the peak of winter, you hear the persistent scolding of a blue jay or the scurry of a pine marten through the undergrowth. But 3 hours before the sun even thought about hitting the horizon, the forest went completely hollow. It wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum. I checked my GPS, something I rarely rely on but carry for emergencies, and the screen was just a mess of static and jumping coordinates. It's a non-responsive zone up there, a place where the frequency of the earth feels like it's being jammed by something heavy and unseen. I started up the ridge, my boots crunching on the frozen crust of the snow, feeling that familiar prickle on the back of my neck. In these mountains, when the silence gets that thick, it means something. Something large and predatory has claimed the immediate area. I wasn't just walking into the woods, I was walking into a territory that had been reclaimed by a Sasquatch, a force that doesn't acknowledge human law. As I crested the first major break in the tree line, I came across a stretch of mud-slicked earth where the snow had melted away due to a geothermal vent. That's where I saw them. The tracks didn't just sit on the surface, they were hammered into the soil, creating deep, water-filled basins in the clay. I knelt down, pulling out my measuring tape, and felt a coldness in my chest that had nothing to do with the weather. The stride length was over 60 inches. For a human to make that leap, they'd have to be at a full sprint, yet the impressions were deep and flat, indicating a calm, methodical walk. A human in a heavy suit would have stumbled, the weight of a costume making them top-heavy in this kind of terrain. But these prints showed a level of balance and power that defied everything I knew about bipedal movement. The mud was still oozing back into the center of the heel mark, a slow, viscous drip that meant the Bigfoot that made these was less than 10 minutes ahead of me. I looked up the slope, seeing the way the brush had been parted, not broken, as if the creature had simply flowed through the thicket like smoke. I realized then that I wasn't looking at a random animal. I was looking at a biological masterpiece that could move through knee-deep silt without ever losing its center of gravity. It was a shuffled teasing of the physical reality I'd spend the next several months trying to prove to a world that prefers the comfort of a lie. I knew I couldn't just tell people about this. I'd done that for decades and ended up with nothing but a collection of polite nods and eye rolls. This time, I had the footage steady, high-definition frames of a dark shape moving across the grey shale of the upper peaks. I took that footage to a man I'd known for a long time, an orthopedic surgeon who had spent 30 years putting human skeletons back together. He was a man of science, a man who didn't believe in fairy tales. When I sat him down in his darkened office and pressed play, I watched his face turn a shade of grey that matched the mountain fog. He didn't look at the hair or the face. He looked at the ankles. He looked at the way the knees stayed bent throughout the entire gait cycle, never fully locking out like a human's would. He told me that if a human tried to carry 800 pounds of weight with that specific degree of knee flex, the patella would explode outward. The sheer mechanical stress would be the end of their physical existence. Yet, on the screen, this Sasquatch moved with the grace of a liquid. It was a professional's nightmare, a being that functioned on a skeletal logic that shouldn't exist in our world. He asked me to loop the video, over and over, his eyes fixed on the way the foot interacted with the uneven ground. "That's a mid-tarsal break," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Humans don't have that. But a Bigfoot, they never lost it." We spent the next 6 hours breaking down the anatomy of that shadow. Every time the creature took a step, the surgeon would point to the screen with a trembling finger, tracing the muscle flare in the thighs. In a fake suit, The fabric folds and sags. It bunches up at the joints because there's no connection between the skin and the muscle beneath. But here, you could see the quadriceps tensioning and releasing under the hair, a ripple of power that traveled all the way up to the glutes. You could see the way the calf muscle bunched into a hard knot to push off the soft earth. The surgeon noted that the length of the tibia, the shin bone, was disproportionately long compared to the femur. It gave the creature a lever system that allowed for massive power with minimal effort. It was a skeletal structure designed for the vertical world of the Cascades, a place where we are clumsy intruders. He explained that for a human to mimic this, they would need to be wearing a suit with internal hydraulics just to keep the joints from buckling under the simulated weight. But there were no motors here. There was only the raw, rhythmic pulse of a living organism, a real Sasquatch, perfectly adapted to a world the government insists is empty. The surgeon saw something in the hip movement that shouldn't be possible, a lateral rotation that suggested a ball and socket joint twice the size of a human's. But he was too afraid to say the word until he saw the final frame. As the sun began to set outside his office, the surgeon turned to me and said something I'll never forget. He said that the way the foot complied with the rocks, the way it wrapped around the edges of the shale to maintain grip like a hand, showed a level of sensory feedback that no boot or costume could ever provide. It was a biological truth hidden in plain sight. If you want to follow this investigation deeper into the places where the maps go blank, subscribe to this channel. We are going to places the authorities tell us don't exist, and we're bringing the truth about Bigfoot back with us. I've spent my life in these woods, and I've seen things that would make a man never want to leave his house again. But the more I see, the more I realize that the real danger isn't in the forest. The real danger is the silence we're told to keep about what's actually out there. We moved on to analyzing the compliance phase of the gait, but I could still see the north slope in my mind's eye. In human walking, our foot is a rigid lever. It's built for walking on flat, predictable surfaces. But the creature on my tape had a foot that acted like a shock absorber and a grappling hook all in one. The surgeon pointed out how the midfoot stayed in contact with the ground long after a human heel would have lifted, distributing the massive weight over a larger surface area. I closed my eyes and was back there pinned behind a massive cedar tree, the rough bark biting into my shoulder, watching through my lens as the Sasquatch navigated a 45-degree shale slide. It didn't slip. It didn't hesitate. The foot itself molded around the sharp edges of the rock, finding purchase where a human would have simply slid toward the end of their life. It's why they don't trip. It's why they can move through a boulder field at 20 miles per hour while we're still trying to find our footing on the first rock. I realized the foot itself had molded around the wood of a fallen hemlock, the toes actually gripping the bark. It was an evolutionary trait that made them the undisputed masters of the high country. The tension in the room grew as we analyzed the center of gravity crisis. Dr. Thorne, the name I'll use for the surgeon to protect his career, pointed out that the creature's torso stayed almost perfectly level as it moved. There was no head bob, no vertical oscillation. When we walk, our heads move up and down with every step. It's inefficient. This thing, however, moved like it was on a rail. This requires a massive amount of energy and a pelvic structure that is significantly wider and deeper than a human's. If a person tried to walk with that constant knee flex, their muscles would burn out in minutes due to the accumulation of lactic acid. But this Bigfoot did it for miles. It suggested a circulatory system and a muscle density that far exceeds anything in the fossil record. We were looking at a predator that could outrun a deer in a thicket and still have the energy to disappear into the high crags before you could even rack around in your protection tool. It made me feel small. It made the mountain feel much larger than it had that morning, a dark, looming presence that watched our every move. We then turned our attention to the audio I'd captured. I'd left a high-gain microphone running near a game trail a few hundred yards from where I'd spotted the tracks. When we synced the audio to the footage, we heard it. I remember the exact moment I recorded this. A heavy, thick musk hit my nostrils, a scent like wet dog mixed with old copper and something sour, like fermented fruit, the unmistakable scent of a Sasquatch. Then came a heavy, metallic clink, followed by the sound of a 3-inch diameter sapling snapping like a dry toothpick. The creature didn't even break its stride. It didn't pause to look down. It just moved through the obstruction as if it wasn't there. For a human to snap wood that thick, they'd have to stop, put their weight into it, or use a tool. This creature just walked through it with its thigh. The sheer kinetic energy involved in that movement was staggering. It reinforced the idea that we weren't dealing with an animal that was trying to stay quiet. We were dealing with a Bigfoot that was so confident in its power that it simply didn't care who heard it. The sound reverberated through the timber, a sharp, violent crack that felt like a warning strike fired across my bow. It didn't take long for the world outside that office to catch wind of what I had. 2 days after I uploaded a low-resolution version to a private server for a few trusted associates, the atmosphere at the trailhead changed. Usually, it's just me and the local hikers, people I've known for years. But that Wednesday, 3 dark, unmarked SUVs were parked at the North Slope Gate, their engines idling in the cold air. Men in tactical outdoor gear too clean to be local rangers, with earpieces tucked under their beanies, were surveying the area with equipment I'd only seen in military journals. They weren't looking for missing hikers. They were scanning the tree line with thermal optics in the middle of a bright afternoon, searching for the heat signature of a Sasquatch. My house in the valley suddenly had utility workers, checking the lines every other day, their eyes lingering on my barn. The pressure was subtle but constant. Even in the surgeon's office, I could hear the faint, high-altitude whine of a drone circling the building, a mechanical predator in the sky. They didn't want the footage. They wanted to know how much more I had hidden in my journals. They wanted to know if the surgeon was going to sign his name to a formal report on a Bigfoot gait. In these mountains, you learn to spot a predator by the way the wind changes, and the wind was blowing straight from the centers of power, cold and smelling of iron. The moment of the orthopedic verdict came when the surgeon sat back, rubbed his eyes, and pointed to the screen one last time. "It's the inverted pendulum," he said. He explained that human walking is essentially a series of controlled falls. We fall forward and catch ourselves with our lead leg. This creature doesn't fall, it pushes. Its gait is an inverted pendulum, where the power is generated from the glutes and calves in a way that requires a different attachment point on the pelvis altogether. He told me that there is no way, under the known laws of anatomy, that this could be a human in a suit. The hip joints would have to be located 4 inches wider than the widest human pelvis ever recorded to allow for that specific leg swing. It was an undeniable biological anomaly. The truth was sitting right there on the monitor, vibrating with a life of its own. What do you think this creature really is? Is this Sasquatch a lost branch of our own family tree, or something that shouldn't be here at all? Comment below and let me know. And tell me what mystery I should tackle next in these high ridges. We then dismantled the man in a suit, myth piece by piece. One of the biggest talking points for skeptics is the arm swing. They say a human can just reach out and swing their arms to look bigger. But the surgeon showed me the centripetal force calculations. Because the Bigfoot's arms are so much longer and heavier than a human's, stretching nearly to its knees, the swing creates a massive amount of torque on the torso. To mimic that, a person in a suit would need to have 20-pound weights strapped to their wrists. If you did that, your gait would become staggered and clumsy. You wouldn't be able to maintain that perfectly level head bob we saw earlier. The physics simply don't add up for a hoax. You can't fake the weight. You can't fake the way the mass of the arm pulls the shoulder forward in a rhythmic, anatomical syncopation that matches the footfall exactly. Every time a skeptic says it's just a guy in a costume, they are betting against the fundamental laws of gravity and motion. The shadow of the fossil record loomed large over our final hours. We talked about the possibility of this being a remnant population of something that was supposed to have become extinct 100,000 years ago. But the surgeon was leaning towards something even more unsettling. He noted that the skeletal adaptations weren't just primitive, they were specialized. This was a creature that had evolved specifically to move in the dark, on steep grades, with total silence. It was a specialist in a way that humans are generalists. We are jacks of all trades, who are masters of none. This thing was a master of the vertical untracked reaches. It made me wonder how many times I'd been watched from those upper ridges by eyes that could see the heat leaving my body. How many times my own clumsy, falling gait had been a source of amusement or irritation for a Sasquatch that moved like the mountain wind itself. The cost of this report became clear very quickly. Within 48 hours of our final session, Dr. Thorne called me from a burner phone. His voice was trembling, a frantic staccato, and I could hear him pacing on a hardwood floor, his breath hitching as he checked his blinds every few seconds. His primary workstation at the clinic had suffered a catastrophic thermal event. The hard drive was a melted lump of plastic, the data scorched away. He'd been called into a meeting with the hospital board and told that his outside interests in Bigfoot were becoming a liability to their federal funding and their reputation. The erasure was surgical. They didn't arrest him. They just began to delete his professional footprint, removing his name from the staff directory and the research journals. Luckily, I've never trusted anything that plugs into a wall. I have my journals, my physical prints, and the raw memory cards buried in a waterproof case in a place where no SUV-driving utility worker will ever find them. I can still feel the weight of those cards in my pocket, the cold plastic a reminder that the truth is a heavy thing to carry through a world built on lies. They can erase the digital files, but they can't remove the reality of what happened on that slope. The truth about the Sasquatch has a way of sticking to you like mountain mud. The question remains, what is the government so afraid of? If people knew that a superior predator was living in the national forests, the entire structure of our relationship with the untracked reaches would change. The logging industry would grind to a halt under environmental protections for a sentient hominid. The tourism board would lose millions as families decided that a trip to the Cascades wasn't worth the risk of being watched by a Bigfoot they couldn't see. But more than that, it's about control. They want us to believe the world is mapped, measured, and mastered. They want us to believe we are at the top of the food chain, discovering that there is something out there that can move through the forest like a ghost and snap a tree like a twig shatters that illusion of safety. It reminds us that we are only guests in the wild, and our stay is at the pleasure of the permanent residents. Share this with anyone who's ready to know the truth. The more people who understand the reality of the Sasquatch, the harder it is for them to keep the lie alive. I went back to the North Slope last week. The snow has mostly melted now, and the mud has hardened into a cracked crust. The surgeon hasn't been back to his office. He took a long-term leave of absence and moved out toward the coast, leaving his life behind. I stood in the same spot where the forest had gone hollow, and I felt that same stillness, that sense of being a trespasser. I don't need a medical degree to tell me what I saw. I don't need a lab report to tell me that the thing moving through the shale was the real master of this ridge. I looked up at the high peaks, where the grey rock meets the clouds, and I saw a single dark shape crest the horizon, huge, fluid, and deliberate, before vanishing into the mist. I didn't reach for my camera this time. I just watched Sasquatch disappear. I realized that the mountain always wins, and it always keeps its own. The secrets are still out there, moving with an impossible gait through the places where the experts are too afraid to go. I'm 66 years old now, and my knees ache on the descents just like Dr. Thorne said they would. I'm a human, built for flat ground and short lives. But as long as I can still lace up my boots, I'll be out here. I'll be watching the tree line and listening for that heavy, rhythmic push of a creature that doesn't need to catch its fall. The journals are getting full, the ink fading on the older pages, and the stories are getting harder to tell, but the truth is worth the wait. If you're out in the woods and the birds stop singing, don't look at your map. Look at the ground. Look for the track that defies the suit. Look for the mid-tarsal break. Look for the sign of the Bigfoot, And remember, just because they tell you the untracked reaches are empty doesn't mean you're alone. Stay sharp. The mountain is watching. And if you're looking for the kind of truth that doesn't come with a government seal of approval, stay tuned. There are more reports coming and more slopes to climb. We're just getting started. I'll see you in the high country.